From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.
Good day. Radio Pilipinas World Service can also be heard on shortwave broadcast through the facilities of the United States Agency for Global Media, or Voice of America, on the following shortwave frequencies: 12.020 MHz, 15.640 MHz, and 17.665 MHz. I'm your host, Leo Magpayo, and this is Dateline Malacañang. Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. on Monday has signed into law the 6.793 trillion peso national budget for 2026 while vetoing 92.5 billion pesos in unprogrammed appropriations, or UAs, to strengthen safeguards on public spending and uphold fiscal discipline. The President approved Republic Act, or RA 12314, or the 2026 General Appropriations Act, or GAA, in a ceremony at Malacañang Palace. In his remarks, President Marcos said, "The crisis of 2025, from climate disruptions and economic uncertainty to exposed corruption, proved that long-delayed reforms could no longer wait." President Marcos described the 2026 budget as a turning point for governance reforms and the rebuilding of public trust. Education received the largest share at 1.345 trillion pesos, covering new plantilla positions, teacher promotions, and nationwide classroom construction. The health sector gets its biggest allocation in history, 448.125 billion pesos, to advance universal healthcare, including funding for the Universal Healthcare Fund, zero-balance billing, disease surveillance, rapid response systems, and long-term health financing. Nearly 129.8 billion pesos was earmarked for PhilHealth, including 60 billion pesos restored following a Supreme Court ruling to help reduce out-of-pocket medical costs. Agriculture received 297.102 billion pesos for supply chain modernization, farmer and fisher folk support, and expanded farm-to-market road networks. Social services are allotted 270.189 billion pesos, aimed at reducing systematic vulnerabilities and pushing the country toward a single-digit poverty rate by 2028. The budget also boosts local government funding, strengthens the Local Government Support Fund, and sets aside 15.33 billion pesos for disaster rehabilitation under the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management, or NDRRM Fund. Funding for military and uniformed personnel remains intact, including updated base pay and higher subsistence allowances. President Marcos stressed that unprogrammed appropriations are not blank checks, saying he vetoed nearly 92.5 billion pesos to prevent misuse and ensure transparency. The chief executive vowed to uphold his constitutional duty to protect public funds and maintain fiscal responsibility.
The year 2025 tested our nation on many fronts. We experienced climate-related disruptions, earthquakes, economic uncertainty, and the exposure of widespread corruption within our system. These challenges are painful, but they also made one thing clear: real change could no longer wait. And so as we enter this year, let us take this opportunity to start moving forward with difficult but needed reforms in governance, to rebuild the trust in us, to strengthen accountability, deliver an honest and effective government to the Filipinos. We are at a critical juncture in the implementation of this administration's medium-term development plan and on the cusp of sweeping reforms in politics and in governance. The 2026 General Appropriations Act is a vital component in all of these. With the signing of Republic Act number 12314, or the General Appropriations Act of fiscal year 2026, we are committing to implement a budget that serves the people, totaling 6.793 trillion pesos. The national budget is aligned with our medium and long-term development plans and vision, reflecting our investment in the Filipino. We thank all members of Congress for the principled exercise of its power, all of the purse, and for the meaningful reforms undertaken to widen participation, to strengthen accountability throughout the budget authorization process. And yet, the passage of the national budget is only the beginning, because today we commence with the most difficult task, to ensure the proper execution and instituting true accountability. The 2026 national budget shall sustain our momentum in education reform, in health protection, in food security, in social security, and in job creation.
That was Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Meanwhile, Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. has cut the unprogrammed appropriations, or UAs, in the 2026 national budget to their lowest level in 7 years, vetoing nearly 92.5 billion pesos in proposed items to reinforce fiscal discipline, transparency, and accountability. In his veto message to Congress, issued alongside the signing of the 6.793 trillion peso General Appropriations Act, the President said the UA was reduced to the bare minimum, stressing that standby funds must only be used when absolutely necessary and under conditions clearly defined in the law. Budget Department data show UA allocations have been steadily tightened, dropping to 150.9 billion pesos in 2026 from 363.4 billion pesos in 2025 and sharply lower than the 731.4 billion pesos in 2024 and 807.2 billion in 2023. President Marcos reiterated that unprogrammed funds are not blank checks, warning against their use as a backdoor for discretionary spending that could widen the fiscal deficit beyond targets. The chief executive said UA releases will be subject to strict safeguards and allowed only when specific triggers are met and validated. Among the items vetoed were proposed UA allocations for budgetary support to government-owned and controlled corporations, or GOCCs, prior years local government unit or LGU shares, personnel services requirements, insurance of government assets, and industry support programs such as the Comprehensive Automotive Resurgence Strategy or CARS. President Marcos Jr. described the veto as a measured exercise of executive authority aimed at rebuilding public trust in the budget process, directing agencies to practice prudent fiscal management to ensure uninterrupted public service. The President also clarified that the vetoes will not affect scheduled salary and benefit increases for civilian workers and uniformed personnel, nor disrupt funding for ongoing foreign-assisted and flagship infrastructure projects, which are already covered under programmed appropriations.
We acknowledge the support of Congress in limiting the unprogrammed appropriations to essential needs. However, I push further and reduce it to the absolute bare minimum. This shall be at the level lowest since 2019. Let me be clear. The unprogrammed appropriations are not blank checks. We will not allow the unprogrammed appropriations to be misused or treated as a backdoor for discretionary spending. Its utilization is provided with safeguards and is only available when clearly defined triggers and tests are met, and will be released only after careful validation. My administration will enforce these safeguards without exception to serve the public interest and to advance our national development goals. We will make releases charged from the UA transparent, providing the necessary details on the funding source and the corresponding purpose. To ensure that public funds are expended in clear service of national interest, I vetoed several items of appropriations with their purposes and corresponding special provisions under the UA, totaling almost 92.5 billion pesos. So I direct now all concerned departments and agencies of the national government to exercise prudent fiscal management to ensure uninterrupted quality public service.
That was Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Meantime, Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. has ordered the strict enforcement of a key provision in the 2026 national budget that bars politicians from taking part in the distribution of cash aid and other financial assistance, ensuring that public funds reach beneficiaries free from patronage. Speaking during the signing of the 6.793 trillion peso General Appropriations Act at Malacañang Palace, the President stressed that the budget must be used solely to serve the Filipino people and never for partisan or political gain. President Marcos emphasized that assistance programs, from assistance to individuals in crisis situations or IICs, Tulong Panghanap Buhay sa Ating Disadvantaged Displaced Workers or TUPAD, and Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program or 4Ps, as well as pensions and cash grants for senior citizens and persons with disabilities, must be protected from political interference. The Chief Executive also highlighted increased funding under the Local Government Support Fund, saying it will help LGUs address development needs, support livelihoods, and build safer, more resilient communities. The President further announced that several budget items will undergo conditional implementation to ensure compliance with existing laws and regulations. These include engineering and administrative overhead expenses, retirement benefits and pensions, capacity development programs, and foreign service posts. President Marcos Jr. also cited programs that will proceed within established legal frameworks, such as the School-Based Feeding Program, the Medical Scholarship and Return Service Program, Pamana initiatives, residential care services for vulnerable groups, infrastructure projects of GOCCs, and programs for senior citizens and persons with disabilities. The Philippine President said these safeguards are intended to ensure that government programs advance long-term national developmental goals.
We will strictly implement the provision on the prohibition of political involvement in the distribution of cash and other forms of financial assistance. Politicians shall be barred from the distribution of any financial aid, and we shall ensure that the support reaches the intended beneficiaries without patronage. Walang bawas, walang kulang. We will also strengthen the role of local government units to the increased allocations under the Local Government Support Fund, enabling them to address local development needs, support livelihoods, and create safe and resilient communities. I stand firm in my constitutional duty to ensure the faithful execution of laws. Therefore, I hereby condition the implementation of certain provisions in this Act to conform to existing laws, policies, rules, and regulations. These include the Quick Response Fund, the QRF, engineering and administrative overhead expenses, payment of retirement benefits and pensions, capacity development programs, and foreign service posts. Moreover, keeping in mind our pursuit of economic recovery and sustainable growth, we shall implement programs and projects in accordance with laws, rules, and regulations. These are the School-Based Feeding Program, Medical Scholarship and Return Service Program, Pamana Program, Residential Care Services to vulnerable groups by accredited social welfare and development agencies, implementation of infrastructure projects of GOCCs, and programs and projects related to senior citizens and persons with disability. This shall ensure that these programs promote our long-term development goals.
That was Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr.
Dateline Malacañang.
Malacañang is asserting that the 6.793 trillion peso national budget for 2026 is free from pork barrel allocations, highlighting stricter evaluation, conditional fund releases, and tighter safeguards compared with previous years. Executive Secretary Ralph Recto made the statement following claims from some lawmakers that the spending plan still contains so-called soft pork or giniling pork. When asked if the palace considers the budget pork barrel free, Recto said legislators lose control once the budget enters the implementation stage. In a palace briefing, Recto emphasized that President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. tightened controls on discretionary spending by sharply reducing unprogrammed appropriations or UAs, funds the president has repeatedly described as not blank checks. President Marcos vetoed nearly 92.5 billion pesos in UA items to reinforce fiscal discipline, transparency, and accountability. While acknowledging Congress's move to limit UA to essential needs, he said he further cut the allocation to the bare minimum, bringing it to its lowest level since 2019. The president also vowed full transparency in UA disbursements, including disclosure of funding sources and intended purposes. Recto detailed the items vetoed by the president, including budgetary support for government-owned and controlled corporations, fiscal support for the CARS program, insurance for government assets, prior year's LGU shares, personnel services requirements, and several special purpose allocations. Among the removed items were the 80 billion pesos SAGIP fund, 6.7 billion pesos in public health emergency benefits, 2 billion pesos for Marawi siege victims' compensation, and other UA provisions that the palace said were either funded elsewhere or lacked adequate safeguards. Only 3 UA items were retained: support for foreign-assisted projects, the revised Armed Forces of the Philippines or AFP modernization program, and the risk management program.
There are roughly 10 items in the unprogrammed fund. Ang tinanggal yung budgetary support to GOCCs, ang halaga niyan roughly 6,895 million. Yung fiscal support sa CARS program na 4.320 billion, insurance for government assets na 2 billion, prior year's LGU shares na 14 million, race program 250,000, GOP counterpart sa foreign assisted projects sa 35 billion 769 million, payments of PS requirements na 43 billion 245 million na nakapaloob na sa iba't ibang ehensya ng pamahalaan at Natanggal na rin naman, I think during yung sagip, wala na yung 80 billion na sagip, wala na rin yung Nampeday property na 210 million, public health emergency benefits na 6.7 billion, Marawi siege victims compensation under the NEP then was 2 billion. Ang natira na lang ay support, tatlong item na lang ang natira. Support to foreign assisted projects, 97 billion 305 million. Revised AFP modernization program na 50 billion. At risk management program na 3.6 billion. So ito yung natira sa unprogrammed fund. Roughly 150 billion 905 million na more or less katumbas ng unprogrammed fund noong 2019.
That was Executive Secretary Ralph Recto.
Dateline Malacañang.
And finally, the Department of Budget and Management, or DBM, is denying claims that salary hikes and pensions for teachers, government workers, and uniformed personnel will be delayed under the 2026 national budget, calling the allegations inaccurate and misleading. In a statement, the DBM clarified that the reported 24 billion peso reduction in the Miscellaneous Personal Benefits Fund, or MPBF, was not a cut, but a realignment. The agency said the amount intended for the increased subsistence allowance of uniformed personnel was simply transferred from the MPBF to the budgets of the concerned agencies to allow faster, more direct, and more transparent fund releases. The DBM stressed that salary increases for all incumbent government personnel, civilian and uniformed, are already built into agency budgets. It added that claims suggesting otherwise are incorrect, noting that any potential impact would only apply to new hires and would depend on how quickly vacant positions are filled. Even then, special purpose funds such as the MPBF and the Pension and Gratuity Fund remain available to address staffing needs. On pensions, the DBM assured that uniformed personnel will not be affected, except possibly those newly retiring under optional retirement, whose benefits will still be processed under existing rules and safeguards. The department emphasized that the realignment was done to improve budget execution, not to reduce benefits. It reiterated that salaries and benefits under the 2026 national budget remain intact and reaffirmed its commitment to protect the welfare of public servants while ensuring responsible and transparent management of public funds.
Dateline Malacañang.
Before we conclude our program, Radyo Pilipinas World Service of the Presidential Broadcast Service can be heard over the following shortwave frequencies: 12.020 MHz, 15.640 MHz, and 17.665 MHz. Radyo Pilipinas World Service is also live on audio streaming. Just download Evox PBS Receiver on your Google Play Store or the App Store from your Apple phone. You can also visit our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Just type in and search for Radyo Pilipinas World Service. Kindly subscribe, like, and share our posts as well. And that concludes this edition of Dateline Malacañang. For Radyo Pilipinas World Service, this is Leo Magpayo. Good day and stay safe.
From the Presidential Palace, Manila, Dateline Malacañang.